Right. So, okay. So everybody should be muted. If you don't see that mute icon, make sure you mute yourself because we are going to start formally in a couple seconds. Um, hold on. Right. So here we go. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. This is the 115th edition of our Zoom public meeting. That's 115. We wish to sincerely thank all those who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora project. Our chairperson today slash tonight is Miss Naima Khan, a cosmetologist who does body massage, facials, and herbal treatment. And is also she also organizes nature walks in Trinidad. She was also one of the organizers of our just concluded ICC Vacation Tour of Trinidad. The tour was a grand success, as you have seen from the images that we have been showing and just a few minutes ago. Naima, welcome. Please take over from here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahaber, for that warm welcome. It is always my pleasure. Good night, good morning, and good evening. Namaste and assalamu alaikum to all of you, depending on the time zone in which you live, because there are always people in this meeting from all over the world. This is the 115th edition of our Zoom public meeting. For 114 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. In the past 2 years and 4 months and 1 week, we have featured over 376 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 114 topics. We join our brothers and sisters in India today and tomorrow in their celebration of 75 years of independence from England in 1947. We pay respect to all the leaders who fought bravely for that nation's freedom. Some people may not know that some of our forefathers in the Caribbean and the wider Indian diaspora started that fight for independence in 1857. 100 years before the Sepoy Rebellion, also called the First War of Independence of India. Many of these ex-soldiers fled India to escape British tyranny. They changed their names to migrate and disguised themselves as laborers during Indian indentureship. Our IT manager, Ravin Ramsingh, will now play a 3-minute video to mark this historic event.
Ravin. Okay, you probably continue until Ravin gets the video. Oh, he's there.
Thank you, Raven. That trailer is from the movie titled Mangal Pandey, starring Amir Khan, maybe related to me. And Mangal Pandey, perhaps related to our own one-time political and trade union leader in Trinidad, Basdev Pandey. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amir Ghafoor Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Dabadine. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it better and bigger, we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions as well as a donation. Please contact Dr. Mahabir for details. Our moderator this evening, tonight, is Shalima Mohammed. She is the co-director of this Zoom platform. She's also a business teacher and a researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalima, welcome, and please take over from here.
Thank you very much, Naima. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Namaste, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for choosing to spend this part of your Sunday with us. This public meeting will take the form of a panel discussion. To avoid trolls invading our program, Raven, our IT manager, has muted everyone. And if you are not muted, I will ask you to please mute yourself. He will give permission to the presenters only to share their screens. Presenters, please be advised that you are not to unmute anyone or allow anyone to share their screens. This meeting should not exceed 2 hours. And our topic today is entitled V.S. Naipaul, Nobel Prize Laureate, His Life and Literature. So V.S. Naipaul was born on August 17, 1932 and died on August 11, 2018 at the age of 85, which is 4 years ago in London. Hence the reason, today being August 14th, we felt it necessary to talk about him. So Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad Naipaul was born of Indian descent in Chabonas, in what is known as Lion House or Hanuman House in Chabonas in Trinidad. And for those of you all who just left us on a recently completed tour, we would have stopped off at Lion House and you would have taken pictures and so on. So today we're talking about the man who wrote the book on this. Naipaul left Trinidad to attend the University of Oxford in 1950 at the age of 17. He subsequently settled in England, although he traveled extensively thereafter. His earliest books are The Mystic Monsieur, The Suffrage of Elvira, and Miguel Street. His fourth novel, A House for Mr. Biswas, was also set in Trinidad. It was a much more important work and won him major recognition. He has the unique distinction of being the only Trinidadian to have won a Nobel Prize. Yet, not a single statue of him has been erected, and not a single building or street has been named after him. Are such monuments necessary, or does his work speak so loudly that he will always have a voice on the international literary landscape? Ladies and gentlemen, let us now hear from a panel of distinguished speakers. And our first speaker is Mr. Al Creighton, a Jamaican resident of Guyana. He's a playwright, poet, theater director, and literary critic. He is a former dean at the University of Guyana and a former associate fellow of the University of Warwick. Sir, go ahead, please. You have 15 minutes, and I'll let you know when you've gotten to the 10-minute mark.
Thank you.
Please unmute.
Thank you very much. I would like to express my appreciation of being allowed the opportunity to participate in this discourse on V.S. Naipaul. Since I have to stick within 15 minutes, I can only pinpoint brief notes towards what I would want to say about Naipaul. I'm going to be basically focusing Naipaul and controversy and reactions to Naipaul arising from these controversies, and points of defense, points in defense of V.S. Naipaul, and to put at the focus of it Naipaul's own response, Naipaul's own responses to the kinds of reactions to him, and a defense in his own words. Naipaul's defense in his own words. When I spoke with him, he seems to be quite contrary to what might have been expected. He seemed to be very quiet and simple, with a willingness to explain himself, how he thought and what he was doing. And I am going to make reference to the winning of the Nobel Prize, because that seemed to have sparked off or reignited the waves of controversies, and also to refer to the tribute paid to him by the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, and also what came out of the interview that I had with him. I'll be very grateful if my PowerPoint could be put on screen.
Fabian, can we get that, please?
I'm sorry, but I thought that it was already set up.
Okay. You can continue speaking if you like. I'm sure he'll bring it up.
Yes. Okay then. So let me start with the first big controversy sparked off by Naipaul, and that is the publication of his book, The Middle Passage, in 1962. And because of the contents of that book, in which he was extremely critical of the Caribbean, and particularly harsh in his references to Trinidad and his references to the Caribbean region. And when he followed that up with a few other publications, he was basically seen as one who was in denial of his origins and who had great contempt for his native land and for his origins in the Caribbean, among the Indians of the Caribbean, and his kind of arrogance and contempt for humanity. Now, this sparked off that wave of controversy. I want to refer to his winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature, because when it was announced that Naipaul had won that prize, it was a catalyst to another wave of reactions to Naipaul. There were widespread reactions to Naipaul coming out of that. And what I found about the reactions is that there was a kind of a temperance of the congratulatory messages and the expression of pride that a Caribbean writer had won the Nobel Prize. But this was to a very large extent influenced by a de-celebration. There was a Caribbean de-celebration of Naipaul at that time, where the Caribbean response to all the controversies were reignited. And there were several stories, myths, and legends concerning Naipaul. And this range of legends and myths and stories were all basically used to illustrate and to give proof of Naipaolian bitchiness. And all of these were reignited at the time of the Nobel presentation. And what I found is that Naipaul had his own response to that, and what I saw as his own response to all of these in what he had to say in his Nobel lecture, because his Nobel lecture was focused primarily on his Trinidadian background. And he dealt in depth with that Trinidadian background and his own origins and the history of Trinidad itself. So that in a way, Naipaul was responding to the criticisms in his Nobel speech. I want to make reference to the UWI celebration of Naipaul in 2007, as well as to what Naipaul said in the interview that I had with him. Now, this slide focuses the middle passage, and the next slide, please. Here in the Nobel presentation, which I've referred to, reactions to Naipaul, which I am calling a Caribbean celebration, and stories, myths, and legends, which amounted to Naipaul bashing. And I want to focus two editorials in the Stabroek News of Guyana. The Stabroek News had one editorial in October 2001, which basically reflected the kind of negative responses to Naipaul and the celebration that accompanied the announcement of his winning of the prize. And the second editorial in the same Stabroek newspaper, which followed Naipaul's appearance at the Calabash presentation in Jamaica, which they described as calabashing Naipaul, because of the same kind of reactions to him that came from the audience in that forum. It reminded me of the kind of controversies arising from Walcott and Brathwaite, what Patricia Ismond described as Walcott versus Brathwaite, where the two writers were separated according to ideology and according to their approaches to the Caribbean. Similarly, there was Brathwaite versus Naipaul in the Wiaklals conference in Jamaica in 1971, where both Brathwaite and Naipaul were placed on the same panel with similar kind of responses from the audience. Next slide, please. Which basically sharpened these controversies. Now, the UWI St. Augustine had a celebration of Naipaul in 2007, which they called VS Naipaul, created in the West Indies. And that was a kind of a subtle, a kind of an ironic reference to the Middle Passage and his famous or infamous statement about nothing was created in the West Indies. And while the UWI was celebrating Naipaul, the title that they chose was basically a reference and itself a reaction to the controversies sparked off by the writer. This symposium was followed, the symposium VS Naipaul created in the West Indies was followed by a publication edited by Jennifer Rahim and Barbara Lala, which put a very balanced discussion, a very rich and balanced discussion to this whole thing, and did not join the bandwagon of Naipaul bashing, but drew attention to the controversies and the several important issues that arose. My own contribution to that symposium was something called In Defense of Naipaul, which was also published in the Trinidad and Tobago Review. Next slide, please. And yes, next slide, please. The Nobel lecture by Naipaul basically focused on, entitled Two Worlds, basically focused on Naipaul's origins in Trinidad, where he even investigated Chaguanas, the origin of the word Chaguanas, and so on. And Naipaul said that everything of value about me is in my books, and I am the sum of my books. And I want to make reference to that because Lala and Rahim did make reference to that particular position taken by Naipaul about him being contained in his books. And that also came out in the conversation that I had with him, where he made the statement, I regret the Middle Passage. And also he said, I don't like Carnival. And those two statements are similar, but they have their important differences, which I hope I have enough time to touch on. Next slide, please.
Mr. Creighton, you've passed the 10-minute mark, but I'll give you 7 minutes further. Okay?
Thank you very much. I think I will need them.
You're welcome.
Right? One of the things that Naipaul said in my conversation is, I regret the middle passage. People felt it was too harsh, but I regret what I wrote there. And when Naipaul said that, and when one is to say that publicly, there is perhaps some surprise and perhaps a kind of an interpretation and a reaction to that, that Naipaul is saying that he regrets having written such a harsh book in the middle passage. But listen to what he said afterwards. Next slide, please. Listen to what he said afterwards. People say I was too harsh in that book, but I should have written a much harsher book. And then he went on to explain that perhaps if he did, many of the errors committed by the Caribbean may not have continued. The West Indies would have been a better place, he said, and many atrocities might have been avoided if he had not soft-pedaled, as he put it, on his serious criticisms of what was taking place and the kind of thinking that was coming out of the West Indies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. A good example of this is another startling statement that he made. And when he made this statement, when he told me this, he said, look, I am telling you this. I never made these things public when I observed them. But if you were to publish this, I am going to deny that I ever said them. What he said was that Prime Minister Forbes Burnham and Prime Minister Eric Williams were thugs. Burnham of Guyana and Williams of Trinidad were thugs. And he said that he observed many things about these villains that he held back. He held back on them in the Middle Passage itself. He held back on them later on when he made public statements, but he observed quite a bit of evidence to support his view of the two prime ministers. At the same time, he was very complimentary in the Middle Passage, very complimentary towards Chelly Jagan and Janet Jagan in the Middle Passage. And while he said that he was a bit too soft on Prime Ministers Burnham and Williams. Next slide, please. Now, having said that he was not so harsh towards Guyana, the next thing that he said might break a few Guyanese hearts, because I asked him whether, because he had made visits to Guyana, and I asked him whether he was intending to write a book about Guyana. Naipaul said, no, I cannot write a book about Guyana. Guyana is too small, it's not big enough, it's not important enough for me to do a whole book on that country. Then he went on to point to the large world audience for his books and the fact that Guyana, a book about Guyana might not, this large world audience might not find a book about Guyana so important or so interesting. And the fact that it is very expensive for him to travel and to research, and therefore he could not invest so many resources on a book devoted entirely to Guyana. Next slide, please. Some of the other things that he said, he made reference to nothing was created in the West Indies. History is built around achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies. And he said that basically he was talking about power and that his words had been misinterpreted. He was talking about power, that the Caribbean did not have the power to impose a culture upon the world. The economy and the political power of the Caribbean was lacking. It was too small to do that. The Caribbean could not do what the USA could have done, what Great Britain could have done. He made references to some of the great cultures, the great civilizations of the world, such as Greece and so on. And he said the West Indies the islands were too small and lacking in power to impose any of that culture upon the world. Next slide, please. Of course, that was in then in defense of Naipaul, I am basically giving a defense of Naipaul in his own words, where he himself explained himself what he was doing. He said, my books never grow stale. My books never grow stale because I stick my neck out. He made reference to the kind of controversies that he had incited, and he made references to the risk, the kind of risks that he took in publishing these books. He said, I stick my neck out. And we can still be talking about such publications as The Middle Passage, which was published as long ago as in 1962. And that such books as The Middle Passage, the Loss of El Dorado, India, An Area of Darkness, and so on, can still be spoken about today because of their importance. And these he referred to as some of the important books that would attract world attention. And they are still topics of conversation because he stuck his neck out, and it shows that his books will never grow stale. Naipaul said that when he visits various countries, he goes out in the field and does his research. In Among the Believers as an Islamic journey, he spoke about, he visited a number of Islamic countries in the Middle East and beyond. And he spoke about going out in the field to carry out his research. And he criticized journalists. He said, journalists who go to these countries remain in an office, use the telephone, or send messages, and that you cannot research a country in this way. He goes out in the field, he does the work, and he sticks his neck out. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Naipaul also said that among the controversies that he had caused, India, he wrote about India, and after the publication of An Area of Darkness, there was quite a bit of consternation and quite a bit of reaction in India about it. But if he goes to India today, he said, he would be welcomed as a son of India, because people have realized in India how true what he said in An Area of Darkness was about the country. And in addition to that, he had also published other books about India, like India, A Million Mutinies Now. And these other works would have basically redeemed him in the eyes of Indians. Now, Naipaul also said, I don't like carnival, but as a Trinidadian, one is not allowed not to like carnival, and one is not allowed to say it, because saying it would amount to a rejection of Trinidadianness, a rejection of the culture, and so on. And he said that that is a denial of individuality and a denial of the self that he finds typical of the Caribbean. And he basically complained about that. Next slide, please. And these are things that were also touched upon by Rahim and Lala in Naipaul, Created in the West Indies. I had mentioned Naipaul bashing, and I had mentioned the kind of stories, myths, and legends that have developed about him, which were basically anecdotes to prove Naipaulian bitchiness. But what I find about them is that they are also terms of endearment, because when you look at them, examine them, you find that underlying in all of that is a kind of admiration, a kind of an expression of amazement at the brashness, at the confidence of this man. And also, if we take a look at the Nobel controversy, there was one of the stories that were going around is what he said when the press telephoned his house after the announcement of the prize, when he was quoted as saying that he was delighted in the award because it was a great tribute to England, my home, and to India, the home of my ancestors, and that there was no mention at all of Trinidad no mention at all of the West Indies. And of course, that was another piece of controversy for which Naipaul was very widely attacked. The story I heard about it, and I picked up this story at the University of Warwick when I was there, it was said that it wasn't Naipaul who made that statement, it was his wife. After the announcement of the prize, he was expecting to receive dozens and hundreds of telephone calls, and he wouldn't answer the phone. He put his wife to answer, and he told her what to say. And she was the one who apparently inadvertently forgot to mention Trinidad and the West Indies. Next slide, please.
Mr. Creighton.
And I'm coming to the end now. I'm coming to the end now, just to mention the intertextual references to this particular kind of response to Naipaul, where Derek Walcott in the poem, The Spoiler's Return, has a line that says, I want to bawl, area of darkness like V.S. Nightfall. And you can see there the kind of pun and the kind of quip, the kind of witty barb aimed at Naipaul by Walcott there in good humor. And Kamau Brathwaite, who after describing Caribbean landscape and beaches and the great history and the great historic and legendary inputs into that landscape, he said, there is too much nothing here. And Lamming in The Pleasures of Exile had said, Naipaul's novels do not move beyond a castrated satire. And that was a bit premature. It was too early a condemnation of Naipaul after only 3 novels, after his first 3 novels. And it was Gordon Rollaire who took that up in the islands in between, when Gordon Rollaire said that Naipaul was too important a writer to be dismissed in the way that Lamming dismissed him. And then, of course, just for interest to make a mention to Naipaul's own inclusion of intertextual references, such as his ridicule of English writer Evelyn Waugh. He laughed at Evelyn Waugh in the novel Half a Life, and he was quite uncharitable in his references to Evelyn Waugh there. Another novelist who did the same thing was Pauline Melville in The Ventriloquist's Tale, in her similar references to Evelyn Waugh. And the final slide, please, next slide, please. The final thing I would want to say basically has to do with that. Next slide, please. In any case, I will end at this point. Well, those are the references, and the next slide basically contain my thanks to my, next slide please, my research assistant, Esther Hamer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Creighton. That was a very comprehensive and contextual presentation. We appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for Mr. Creighton based on his presentation, please do take a note of it. We will be taking questions in the Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. So we move on now to our second presentation, and this is from Dr. Vijay Maharaj of Trinidad. She's a lecturer in literary, cultural, and communication studies at UWI St. Augustine. She's the author of the just published novel, The Mystic Monsieur's Wife. Welcome, Dr. Maharaj. You have 15 minutes. Dr. Maharaj, can you unmute, please? Oh, Robin, do you need to unmute her?
You should be able to unmute.
Okay.
She was not able to unmute herself until permission was granted. So very typical of life in the third world that that Naipaul was interested in talking about. So I think that what I want to start with is that in every single book, as well as in interviews and films, V.S. Naipaul has asserted that he's a writer and that he has followed no other profession. A person can, of course, assert anything about themselves. We, the readers to whom the assertion is addressed, will, of course, have to decide whether this self-assessment is acceptably accurate or not. As a Naipaolian scholar, I have found that the assertion is not just acceptable, but absolutely apropos. This has led me to believe, in fact, that indeed a reading of the writer's life across and via his various works makes for a more accurate and insightful biography than the one that was authorized by V.S. Naipaul for Patrick French. I mean, we can debate that at length. Within the 12-minute time frame that I have been given, however, I can barely delineate this. But I believe that in honor of today's celebration of Naipaul's life and literature, a brief explanation of the thesis will suffice. Of course, everyone may well know that V.S. Naipaul wrote Miguel Street before he wrote anything else. But that collection of short stories was not published until 1959. For literary scholars, there is a story here, a tale about the limitations and constraints of the writer's life. Miguel Street was published only after Naipaul had demonstrated that his abilities to produce the more favored form of prose, the novel, was as good as his skills with crafting short stories. Interestingly, in standard Naipaolian textbooks like Bruce King's textbook, the first V.S. Naipaul novel publication of 1957, The Mystic Monsieur, which introduced V.S. Naipaul to the world, is often treated in tandem with Miguel Street and the second novel, The Suffrage of Elvira. In these three works, we gain a particular story about the writer. He's a man who is concerned about establishing his position as a writer among others, with more secure credentials, with more secure British connections than he himself had. I would want to suggest that at this point, Naipaul was concerned about one thing more than any other. That is, the recognition of his identity as a writer in a global environment with intense competition. Not unexpectedly as a result, Naipaul created caricatures of the individuals he represented, rather than how it could possibly matter to the people he was representing that they had been so represented. This attitude to his writing did not linger very long. He undertook the production of the massive epic, A House of Mr. Biswas, which placed him on the literary map forever. Thereafter, however, he was not just a writer of the comedy of the plantocracy and plantocratic society, but of the complexities of the life of the so-called New World. He would take this searching gaze throughout the Americas, from Argentina to New York, across Africa, the Middle East, and India, and in the process, show that we were all living in a new world. Indeed, if anybody were to want to pick me up on the idea that Naipaul created post-colonial literature, I would be happy to debate the point, because that was the movement of his work. Firstly, he wrote caricatures of ourselves. Bruce King recognized it. But then, when he turned inward, you remember Rex Nettleford's statement, inward stretch, outward reach. He was doing both. And in the writing of A House of Mr. Biswas, he reached inwardly. And he produced for us something that went beyond the comedy, something that went beyond the comedy of every day, and not about just the tragedy of Mr. Biswas's life, but also about the problems of the plantocracy and plantocratic society. And then he came to recognize that those issues that he was seeing in these small spaces, parochial spaces, if you want, that there were the complexities of the life of the entire New World. And that is why he took his searching throughout the Americas, from Argentina to New York, across Africa and the Middle East and India, and in the process to prove that we were all living in a new world. The time was different.
Dr. Maharaj, excuse me, you have 10 minutes left. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, I don't.
Okay, no problem.
So the extent to which Naipaul's approach to his understanding of life in these regions impacted lives around the world is evident everywhere. And it is most certainly captured in the second volume of the Bloomsbury V.S. Naipaul series, which is called V.S. Naipaul, The Revolutionary Decade, which is to be released in 2023. This book covers the text, The Mimic Men and a Flag on the Island. And those two were published in 1967. This was immediately followed by The Lost of El Dorado, a history, in 1969. And then the big one, the Booker Prize winner in A Free State in 1971. The Overcrowded Barracoons and Other Articles came in 1972, immediately after, and Guerrillas in 1975, and India, A Wounded Civilization in 1977. In this particular anthology, writers like Pankaj Mishra, who collected and edited so many of his essays, speak of the immense impact that Naipaul had on the way that people conceived of themselves and of what they saw themselves as being capable of. This article that I referred to, that was in which Mishra shared his views, was published in the N+1 magazine. And Mishra notes in that article many things that would be of interest to us. But his correspondent, Nikhil Saval, who by the way is running to be one of its top politicians in the US at the moment, Nikhil Saval also wrote a very important observation. He notes that in the tradition of community organization in which I had been trained, I was taught that the mode of regarding my past, any humiliations and shame and anger and privations, as something to be dug up, narrated, and ultimately politicized. Family and friends, schooling, stories from childhood, these were the source, not just of politics, but the obstacles to politics, behaviors that keep one from organizing, that keep one from power, and even more importantly, solidarity. Everywhere in Naipaul's writing, there are roots into the political world that are diverted back into the self, humiliations that lead into humiliations of others. That divergence back into the self, instead of political organization for the process of creating change, may well be one of the most distinguishable differences between the indented migrants of those who had gone to build railways and establish communities across Africa, and those who were educated in an independent India and sought to make their fortunes in Europe and America. It is certainly worthy of further investigation and reflection, although the methodology for establishing such a hypothesis or any other hypotheses may well be an expensive and complex one that would ironically pose immense challenges for the investigation. Interestingly, however, the praises that Nikhil Saval offers to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who delivered the first Naipaul Memorial Lecture at the UAE in St. Augustine. In his comparison between V.S. Naipaul and Thiong'o, And that lecture is part of the second book that I've referred to, which is entitled Angels of Imagination, a Globalectic Reading of the Right and the World. Thiongo tells us humorously, I first and last met V.S. Naipaul in January 2001 in Percato, Udine, Friel, northern Italy. He was already knighted by the Queen of England to become Sir V.S. Naipaul. It would be my first time to meet with a knight face to face, and for a meal at that. In my youth, I had read quite a lot about Sir Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and here was one. At last, I expected to meet a fully armored knight on a horse, stirrups, sword, helmet, and all, ready to battle the enemy of Christendom. Had I not given up the name James? Googie says this, however, only as evidence of the tomfoolery sometimes and awesomeness otherwise of the imagination. In fact, he goes on later to include Naipaul among the angels of the imagination, although he prefaces the observation with this quote unquote, but they are tainted angels, burdened by marks of their race, gender, and class experience of history. Capturing on paper what one has been given by imagination is a struggle. And every writer will tell you it's a lonely struggle. Good intentions will not help. Intellectual accomplishment will not help. It is a wrestling with God to finally manage to capture one's seeds in the imagination. And I think that I want to say thank you to the organizers of this event for having recognized that V.S. Naipaul is sufficiently important that we need to pay respect to him year after year, because he's one of our angels of the imagination. One of those who has taught us how to see, how to feel, how to think, what to think, when to think, why to think. And I think that perhaps that is why the speaker who follows me, Dr. Bhuindranath Tiwari, had decided that one of the institutions on the University of the West Indies in the Western campus would be called V.S. Naipaul, critical thinker, because that's what he is. As a writer, he went into the world and he observed and he wrote what he observed. If you understand him as an observer, then you understand what he is talking about, and you understand why he is saying what he is saying, and why all that he has said is still relevant to us. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say these few words to you.
Thank you so much for a most interesting presentation and insightful analysis into the man and his work. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce our third speaker, and Dr. Tiwari has consented to being speaker number 4. Our third speaker was not publicized because we learned of his willingness to present only after the invitation had gone out. But let me introduce you to Mr. Victor Lau. He was born in his native Fiji Islands. Like Sir Vijay Naipaul, he's a descendant of Indian indentured laborers. And like Sir Vijay, he was educated at the University of Oxford, where he was Reuters, Wingate, and Research Fellow. He is currently recuperating from 2 bouts of long COVID. He has written on Fiji, but is in exile at Oxford since the 1987 racially motivated coup in that island. Welcome, Victor. Go ahead, please. You appear to be unmuted, but we are not hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. But can you unmute one more time?
Yep.
Yes. We can hear you now.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me because I'm
Yes, we're here.
struggling. I had lost my voice, and also basically, I'm not going to be talking about Naipaul's novels or anything, although I have read all his novels, and like most diaspora, the descendants of Indian indentured laborers, House of Mr. Biswas, Miguel Street, and others have remained classics to us. And all you have to do is basically replace Mr. Biswas with my grandfather. You could see all sorts of, it's very common. It's not only a Trinidadian thing. So, but what I have always been interested, I met him a couple of times, was what was he like a student at Oxford? Because after all, nobody has actually looked or followed his journey from Trinidad to Oxford to London and to a wider world. And I was really, really surprised that no one had actually done it. So what I did was I began, collecting materials for different chapters and all. And unfortunately, it took his death in 2018 for his old college to finally basically hand me his student file. And as you can see, the first slide, the title is V.S. Naipaul, the Oxford student, 1950 to 54. And when you see there's a small thing says, I accept the offer. And from his albums and the student file, you can see his photograph. There he is with a group of other students. I'm just going to run through some very brief. I'm not going to talk on any of them, but this is like random chapters that I have been working on. And one is Trinidad and indentured Indians. I think that has to be the starting point to understand Trinidadian Indians and also Fijian Indians and other Indians. Then I am looking at the Naipaul family, growing up, the young V.S. Naipaul, and then his application to Oxford, which was basically a ticket out of the island. And I have written a whole chapter on it, and I'm not going to speak here on that, but hopefully, as I said, I hope to finish the book by next year. Then I look at the journey basically from Trinidad to New York to London to Oxford. I have looked at the passenger list of who else was on that journey with him. And I have basically, as I said, looked through other things. And then I have looked at his arrival at University College, Oxford. And I have also looked at the letters, home, his social life, sports, drama, theater. And I'm going to be extracting a lot of the contents of those letters and then using them in different chapters. And then I'm also looking at the aspiring young journalist, his writings with the ISIS and Oxford Tory. Unfortunately, the 1952 edition of the Oxford Tory student newspaper is missing, but I'm looking at it. And then the Martless Society, about where he became a secretary and president, and he writes about the Martless Society to his pa in Trinidad. Again, the issues from 1952 is missing, and I have been searching for it for a year now, and Oxford University archives people are also helping. Then I have gone and looked at the first and second public examination questions, basically. We do not know what questions Naipaul answered, but I have, I've got a fairly good idea of what he might have answered. So that is something else I'm looking at. And then I'm looking at Tolkien. We forget that he was Tolkien's student, although he did not like fantasy novels. When the last chapter I'm looking at is the Nobel Prize for Literature. And irony is Tolkien was also nominated in the 61, 69, and etc. But it was his student Naipaul who wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, because the Swedish Academy felt that Tolkien's writing was not up to standard. Then I'm looking at his application to do a B.Lit after he did his BA in English Language and Literature. And as he famously claims that, he was failed by one Professor Wilson, the Merton Professor of English Literature at Oxford. I will
Mr.
be coming
Lal?
back. Hello?
Mr. Lal, excuse me. Would you mind sharing your screen with us, please?
Didn't I share it? No.
No, unfortunately, no.
How do you go about doing this now? I have not been on Zoom for ages.
Okay, it should be open on your desktop first. Then you come back to Zoom. You click on share screen.
I did actually share
You
screen.
did? Okay,
Yeah.
we're not seeing it.
Yeah.
You could continue to present without it if you like, but if you would like us to see your screen, we need to, you need to share it.
It doesn't click on this. Can you see it now?
No, we're still not seeing it.
Oh, that is strange. But I've also, I've been very critical of Patrick Frank's biography of Naipaul. What I feel is, once he found Patricia Hale's letters and diaries, he basically, ran away with it and turned him into one of these monsters, and which has now stuck with Naipaul. I have also looked at his tutor, Peter Bailey's recollection, where he says that, according to French, a dossier with photographs, smiling Indian boy, you can imagine, charming little Indian boy he looked, a very distinguished achievement from his big grammar school in Port of Spain. And because I loved India and had many Indian friends, I took him on. And I have argued in the book, or I'm arguing in the book, that it is not true, because if you look at his application, he is not smiling. He's got a very serious photograph. Can you see it now? No, my screen.
Unfortunately, no. If you like, you can always share it with us later, and we will feature it on the recorded program.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is basically that we have to basically ground Naipaul as a student at Oxford and look at his results, look at what he was doing, and then only we can understand him as a writer. I have looked at his application, to do the B.Lit. And what he wanted to do was, he wanted to look at the Elizabethan novel. But again, he was failed. And I have also looked at all his letters basically reek of poverty. He's always asking for money, either from the college or from his family. And also I have looked at that. But what I have also looked at is this whole question of whether he was an Indian of West Indian origin or pure Indian. And I found a letter from his tutor, Peter Bailey, to the Univ Dean, Giles. And Peter Bailey writes to Giles, if you have to write more ever references, it might be better to describe VSN not as an Indian of West Indian origin, which will make them think he is 3/4 Negro, 1/4 Creole or something, but as of purely Indian stock, whose family has been domiciled in the British West Indies for many years. A small point, but it might put Pukka Sahibs, Pukka Hindus, or Kucha racialists off. So you find that even the university feels that, labeling him West Indian might be a disadvantage to him. And again, from the files, you see the Master of Univ has written a reference to the Indian, to the civil service, because Naipaul wanted to work for the British civil service. And the letter is very fascinating. And I'll just read it out to you. It says, V.S. Naipaul is a British citizen of Hindu descent from the West Indies. He is a good linguist in French and Spanish, as well as in English, which is his natural tongue. He is intelligent, with a very quick mind and a good memory. I find him charming. He is direct and friendly and has a strong sense of humor. He has been very popular here. He got a very good second in the schools with much alpha. We were expecting a first. The chairman of examiners, Tolkien, told me his Naipaul's translations were better than those of all other candidates. He's a natural writer, but over satirical in attitude. He has written a novel, not published, and several of his short stories have been broadcast. Yet, one must write of him with some reserve for the accident of his origins. An Indian who has never seen India, does not speak Hindi, and who cannot feel British West Indian to be his home, has made him one volatile, rather cynical, and chancy in achievement. He wishes to stay in Europe and do not return to Trinidad. If he obtained a job with the British civil service and settled down, he would probably do well, as he's intelligent and industrious. But then again, we have talked about Peter Bailey. In 2004, Peter Bailey finally snaps against Naipaul. And I found a letter, a very interesting letter to another professor, where Peter Bailey says, and I will conclude on that. He says, "Dear Michael, thanks for thoroughly sending me the VSN piece for the Spectator. I am really getting rather wary of his continued repeating of himself. It is, of course, almost endlessly interesting to a point, particularly about childhood in Trinidad and about Trinidad. I am even more annoyed by his repeated dismissal or even more frequent criticism of Oxford, perhaps chiefly for not giving him a first. I expect you have seen or even read, or at any rate read bits of his letters between a father and son, which give a totally different picture of Oxford, especially of Univ, that is his college. I find his present total lack of generosity, not to say of gratitude, pretty sickening. My family and I saw a lot of him. He was quite often in our house and family. he loved cinnamon toast for tea, and I would have known if he had, as he repeatedly claims, a breakdown. I acknowledge this. He once went under the weather, the asthma bed, the winter vial, told me he had once or twice felt suicidal. And I said to him, Vidya, if that comes again, come straight to our house and talk to us and have a meal and play with the children. That feeling has become his a nervous breakdown. I will tell you more when we meet. On that note, I just want to say that, this is where I am also ending this presentation, but I'm sorry, as I said, one is I'm not well, two is I do not know why the technology failed. Thanks very much. But I'm more than happy to answer questions and all later.
Very well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation as well. And I'm sure that there'll be questions for you at the end. Thank you once more. Ladies and gentlemen, let's bring on our fourth speaker. And this is Dr. Brinsley Samaroo, who is also from Trinidad. He's a former government minister, a former principal of St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. He's the author of the book entitled V.S. Naipaul Revisited, which was published in 2007. Welcome, Dr. Tiwari. Please let us know when you're ready for your presentation. Go ahead, please. Kindly unmute. Okay, okay, one right.
Unmuted now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I am very grateful for the opportunity to present. And what I'm going to present, I'm going to tell a story about it, is how Naipaul's manuscripts and papers ended up at the University of Tulsa, where it is now housed. Before I proceed, I do want to congratulate the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and its partners for what it has been able to do, 115 sessions like these. And I do want to congratulate any people who are on the chat today from India, as that country is celebrating its 75th anniversary of independence. Now, when I first heard that V.S. Naipaul had made arrangements for all of his manuscripts and papers to be housed at the University of Tulsa, I was surprised. Why Tulsa? I couldn't understand. Why not UWI? Why not a British university? No one knew what the collection consisted of. But in March of this year, I set out for the University of Tulsa to find out a few things. One, what did the University of Tulsa actually have of Naipaul's works and papers? Why did Naipaul agree to leave his legacy there? What was there in the collections that would help me to understand Naipaul better? Would the collection reveal things about Naipaul that I did not know before? My visit allowed me to answer tentatively all four of these questions. I can't say that I have as yet conclusive answers, but in my mind, and going over my notes from time to time, I come up with perspectives that help me to probe further. If you look through the Naipaul papers at the University of Tulsa, there are manuscripts at various stages of writing of Miguel Street, but there is no manuscript of a house of Mr. Biswas, nor Mystic Monsieur or Suffrage of Elvira. That is because these manuscripts were destroyed in a London warehouse in 1992. By 1994, though, all Naipaul's remaining papers and everything produced or connected to him since 1992 found their way, or with goodwill will find their way eventually, to the McFarlane Library Special Collections at the University of Tulsa. Because in 1994, the agreement arrived at covered past, present, and future. So here's the first prompting or motivation for Naipaul: to find a resting place for his work while he was still alive. The 1992 loss of these early vital manuscripts of his 3 novels set in Trinidad was devastating to Naipaul. After all, these novels introduced him to the world as a writer, gave Trinidad and Tobago a firm place in West Indian and world literature, and gave the Indian community in Trinidad and Tobago a presence, a voice, its bearings, and a context. The loss of the manuscript of A House of Mr. Biswas, the book that solidified the reputation of V.S. Naipaul as a writer of stature and is today regarded as a masterpiece of 20th century literature, was especially unnerving for Naipaul. Naipaul spoke to me about this loss in 2007 during an interview that I did with him, V.S. Naipaul, critical thinker. When as principal, he was my guest at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. But he only then spoke of Biswas. It was only after I got access to his papers that I realized that the manuscripts of his 3 early novels set in Trinidad were no more. Of the early works, only the manuscript of Miguel Street remains. The Daily Telegraph of October 13, 1992 carried the story of the loss with the headline, "Tragedy Befalls the House of Mr. Biswas." Naipaul didn't say anything then, but Gillan Aitken, his literary agent, who accompanied him to Trinidad on his visit to UWI in 2007, said this: "It is an absolute tragedy, especially as he had catalogued the material meticulously." So I would venture that the first motivating factor for finding a place for his remaining manuscripts and papers was the loss of these manuscripts in 1992. He needed to secure his literary legacy somewhere. 1992 gave him a sense of urgency. The second issue, however, would be money. While V.S. Naipaul's reputation was growing and his stature rising, he was not selling a lot of books, nor was he making a lot of money. In 1992, he would have been 53 years old, half of his life gone, with a solid reputation building up and highly acclaimed works behind him. Biswas, Mimic Men in a Free State, Gorillas, A Bend in the River, Among the Believers, Enigma of Arrival. But he was struggling financially, often felt financially vulnerable. In 1993, he was awarded the British Literature Prize, and that came with a substantial monetary endowment of £30,000. When he spoke on that occasion, he mentioned novelist Anthony Powell and playwright Harold Pinter as being worthy of the British Literature Prize, which he was in fact receiving. Pinter, in fact, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2005. But around this time, several things began to happen at the same time. V.S. Naipaul had begun to engage the United States in the 1980s. He had appeared in Vanity Fair. They were writing about him in the New York Review of Books. And on the urging of the editor of the New York Review of Books, he had agreed to cover the Republican National Convention in 1984. Ronald Reagan, you would remember, emerged as a candidate, and this was in Dallas, Texas. Following that, he spent time in the southern United States doing the research and interviews for A Turn in the South, which was published in 1989. As I mentioned in 1993, he is awarded the prestigious British Literary Prize ahead of Powell and Pinter. He's looking for a place to house his manuscripts, and he wants to be paid for making his work available. And Gillan Aitken, his literary agent, is exploring the possibilities of an appropriate institution and the possible financial rewards that might come with it. And it is during this time of Naipaul's rise, his expansion to the United States of America, and possibilities of financial reward, that the connection was made by Gillan with Tulsa. Now, I'm going to divert a little bit to tell the story. Thomas Fabian Staley, who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and got his master's degree in literature from the University of Tulsa, and who by 1962 had earned his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, writing his dissertation on F. Scott Fitzgerald, joined the faculty of the University of Tulsa and taught literature there for 25 years. At that time, he founded the James Joyce Quarterly. And until he left the University of Tulsa for the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, he continued to edit the journal for a quarter of a century. That journal, which became the formidable academic journal on James Joyce. He also wrote about writers like Dorothy Richardson, but most notably for our purposes, Jean Rhys, and he wrote about them as British novelists. Jean Rhys, we will also know and regard as a West Indian novelist born in Dominica. Dr. Staley became Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences in the 1980s, and later Provost at the University of Tulsa. There he began a career of acquiring literary collections for the McFarlane Library, and he established a special collection sections for which he acquired Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. He acquired the papers of British critic Edmund Wilson and the papers of Richard Ellman, who wrote an astounding biography of James Joyce, that formidable Irish writer, in addition to a significant portion of James Joyce's own papers and manuscripts and the books and papers of British writer Muriel Sparks. This is how the core of the manuscript collection of Special Collections Archive of the McFarlane Library at the University of Tulsa began to be built up as a collection of Anglo-Irish writers of the 20th century, and the beginnings and the shaping of a modernist collection at that McFarlane Library of the University of Tulsa. In addition to the writers already mentioned, they also had housed at the University of Tulsa the works of Cyril Connolly, Rebecca West, Malcolm Lowry, Richard Murphy, and Christopher Isherwood. It is in this context of a special collection taking shape, focused on moderns and with Anglo-Irish writers of note, that Gillan Aitken made contact with the University of Tulsa, and they expressed an interest. George H. Gilpin, who was the provost there at the time, made contact with Gillan, and he facilitated the process. They offered Naipaul 500,000 US dollars for everything Naipaul and the Naipaul related, and he accepted. They paid the writer half on signing and the other half over 10 years. They held a commemorative dinner for him as they celebrated him and his work on March the 22nd, 1994. And that is how his papers ended up at Tulsa. Naipaul, who had written one of the most penetrating pieces on the West Indies, The Middle Passage, 1962, did not like being called a West Indian writer because he found that that was very limiting. His novels can attest that he was Trini through and through, but he would not want to be limited as a Trinidadian writer either. Although he received the British Literary Award, and he could be comfortable with that, to be in Anglo-Irish company among the modernists, 20th century giants, probably gave him some kind of comfort. And with Jean Rhys there, he could feel more connected and better at home. And to be in the same special collection with James Joyce, who did not win a Nobel Prize, but who was one of the most influential and critically successful authors of the 20th century, must have meant something to him. I think that I can hear V.S. Naipaul agreeing that after all is said and done, he ended up in good company and therefore in a good place. University of Tulsa, of course, ended up being a big winner. As Professor Lars Engel, Chapman Professor of English at Tulsa, said about the papers housed at McFarlane Special Collections, and I quote, "The collection is unique because it is the entire life archive. For writers of the caliber and reputation of someone like Naipaul, these collections don't typically go in one place." McFarlane Library and University of Tulsa have continued their acquisitions. They have acquired the entire works, writing, songs, and audios of Bob Dylan, who amid some controversy won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. Whether Naipaul will be comfortable in his company, I do not know. But University of Tulsa is locating a Bob Dylan museum where all Dylan's material will be housed, adjoining the Woody Guthrie Museum in Tulsa, because there is a direct link between Woody Guthrie's social commentary songwriting tradition and the evolution of songwriters and artists such as Dylan, who helped to evolve the American folk tradition. With the ambition, drive, and funding available to McFarlane and Tulsa, it is very likely that other writers will join the acquisition. The manuscripts of John Dos Passos, for instance, another modern, have also been acquired. And who knows, further acquisitions may include other Nobel laureates, since the University of Tulsa now has two laureates, Bob Dylan and V.S. Naipaul. So in the end, a number of things converged to make McFarlane Special Collections at the University of Tulsa the home for Naipaul's papers in 1994. The lost manuscripts in 1992, the need for money when Naipaul was in his 50s, the quest by Gillan Atkins for a connection, Naipaul's 1980s connection with the USA and the time spent writing A Turn in the South, Thomas Staley's shaping of the Anglo-Irish Moderns collection at Tulsa University, which included James Joyce and Jean Rhys, and the shepherding of the agreement between University of Tulsa and V.S. Naipaul by then Provost of Tulsa, John Gilpin. that is my presentation. I have some slides if I still have some time, and I will not speak to the slides. I just want to show you because they represent some of the things that I was able to photo in the archives at the University of Tulsa.
Yes, Dr. Tiwari, we've been running it very slowly while you spoke.
All
So
right.
we'll start at the beginning now, and if you'd like to address any of the slides, you're free to do so.
Well, the first thing, I mean, on the first slide, what you see there is the occasion of the celebration of Naipaul and his work on the acquisition on March the 22nd, 1994. And Naipaul wrote for that something he called an inheritance, which he talks about his origins in Trinidad and Tobago and his movement out, etc., and how it affected him. And George Gilpin also wrote something commemorating the occasion. On one of the slides, you would see the manuscripts of Miguel Street, and you would see Naipaul's writing, making corrections on the manuscripts. It was, to me, it was an amazing feeling to see that at work, especially that piece of work, which was his first writing, not the first published, as was pointed out earlier. But to hold those manuscripts in my hand, I want to say I felt something that perhaps I had never felt before. On the issue of Biswas, remember there is no manuscripts, but he has a one-pager in which he says that from month to month, I felt my talent grow. And it was like a discovery of something that did not belong to me. Naipaul finding in the writing of Biswas and writing about how he felt, which was that Biswas, the novel, was the liberating force that allowed Naipaul to become a writer in the world who would come to be recognized by the world. I have some maps there from 1987, which Naipaul had in his collection, and you will see that Spain had a view of Trinidad and Venezuela, which some people say Venezuela still has today, of Trinidad being part of their holding, so to speak, and connected to the Eastern Caribbean. In the Gurudeva thing, Gurudeva was very important to Naipaul. It made his consciousness and the determination of effort required to become a writer. And what is interesting in there is that there is a notation which says the start of our writing. So he saw writing not only in his own context, but he gave his father the credit for being the originator. And he saw that writing was a family tradition. Remember, Shiva was also a writer, and there have been other writers since. And I had a copy of the book of poems given by C. Prasad as a gift, and he called him Vidyadhar in it. And he gave him that book at 3 years, 10 months, and 15 days. So C. Prasad always had in mind that VS would be a writer, and VS must have carried these things, understanding that this was to be his mission in life. I included in the things a first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses and a signed copy by James Joyce himself of the 10th volume of 1,000 copies that were the first edition of James Joyce. And the last thing I have there is at the Royal Jail, where there is a sign which says Pro Rege et Lege, which is for king and law. And this was put up by Picton, Governor Picton. And this is now, he has now become a character of controversy here in Trinidad and Tobago. being labeled a racist and so on. But Naipaul spoke to me about that. It's recorded in something I wrote and in the film of the interview, in which he talked about the fact that Picton had really saw his presence as establishing a regime of law and order. And we will see how that controversy goes, but I included it there because I felt it had some resonance, not only for Naipaul's thinking, but for our times. Thank you very, very much for listening to me. It has been an honor to present.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tiwari. And this was an exceptional presentation. That collection of materials is quite unique, and we really thank you for bringing it to us. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you to all of our presenters for their expertise and availability, their time, their sacrifice, and their effort in being with us today. Please note that this meeting is being recorded live and will be uploaded later after editing on YouTube permanently for posterity. And I'd just like to acknowledge all of those who are currently on YouTube watching our live stream. The floor is now open for questions, comments, and contributions. We'll have brief responses from the presenters. So I'll ask you now to please, if you would like to ask a question or make a contribution of some sort, please raise your electronic hand. You need to use the reactions button at the base of your computer screen. Only then would Ravin allow you to unmute and to speak. So please go ahead and raise your hand so that we can call upon you. Yes, indeed, Varen. Excellent presentation. Let me see if I can get on the full screen. Mr. Shari Singh, can I invite you to make a contribution? We understand that you would have done your master's on VS Naipaul, and we are very pleased that you are here with us. So please go ahead, Mr. Singh. Can you unmute? Ravin, can you unmute Mr. Shari B. Singh, please?
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
We're hearing you now, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me, okay. Sorry, briefly, this was a master's dissertation at the University of Natal here in South Africa, in Durban, and it was completed in 1990, and the topic was the image of India, a study of V.S. Naipaul's literary self in a selection of his works. And in the study, I looked at the novels. The first one I looked at, apart from the introduction and going into V.S. Naipaul's background and his overall contribution to literature at that time. The first chapter was on V.S. Naipaul, the Mystic Messiah. The second one was on An Area of Darkness. The third one on A House for Mr. Biswas, and the one that had the last one, the one that had been most recently published at the time, was The Enigma of Arrival. So I looked at the whole, the works that have been mentioned already, the Middle Passage, and his concept of Indianness and the departure from India, his sort of aloofness and exclusivity as an Indian, being proud of his origins, but also not willing to identify with any of the other kind of cultural groups, although he does speak of the interculturation in Trinidad. Of course, the writing of the self, his self, because this was also a study of his literary development, was his beginnings, his departure to England, Oxford, that has been mentioned, his frustrations at being in Trinidad. He just wanted to get out. He just wanted to escape. In the 4 works that I looked at, there is this awareness and this growth and confidence of Naipaul as a writer. Of course, A House of Mr. Biswas, as has been universally acknowledged, one of his, or if not his greatest work, and it was written when I think he was about 28 or 29 years old, or it was published at that time. Going back to, getting to the last chapter, which was on the enigma of arrival, based on a Chirico painting, which he said, as he said, I saw that as an accomplishment of Naipaul's own arrival and the kind of amazement. At the end, he says, I think man and writer were the same person, and it took so much writing and so much time to get to that synthesis. And that synthesis, to me, at that time in 1990, when I completed the study, expressed the arrival of a wholeness of himself and an understanding of himself. And I conclude by saying that the physical departure for England, for V.S. Naipaul, was from Trinidad, but the psychological departure was from India. So it's a journey of finding himself from India to Trinidad to England, and then his travels, which have been mentioned by the speakers. And I must compliment all the speakers for the most thrilling presentations. I was very, very deeply engrossed by them. Okay, that's it. If you have any other questions, I could answer briefly, but I'm sure you are short of time at the moment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. Thank you for contributing. At this point in time, I'd like to call on Virendra Singh to go ahead with his contribution. Viren, unmute, please. Ravin, can you unmute Virendra? Okay, try it one more time, Viren. Unmute.
Thank you very much.
We have an echo.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mohammed. Question for Mr. Tiwari. You said that Naipaul covered the National Convention during the Reagan's running for the presidency. I've never read that. That's incredible, and I would love you to either comment on that a little bit more and maybe privately tell me where I could read much more on that. Thank you.
Viren, who is your question addressed to? Unmute again, please. I could not, I did not hear who the question was addressed to. Who would you like to respond?
Mr. Tiwari.
Sorry?
Mr. Tiwari.
Dr. Tiwari, okay.
What's the question?
Can you repeat the question, please, Viren? There was an echo.
You made a comment that Naipaul covered the Reagan's National Convention during his run, and I was wondering if you had any details about it or where I could read much more on that.
Yeah, well, he wrote about it in American publications because he was covering it for the New York Review of Books, and I think Vanity Fair, if I'm not mistaken. And so he attended the convention, he interviewed people, he would talk to them in the corridors, he would schedule interviews with them. And I think that is where his interest in doing a turn in the South emerged. So I think that that exposure to the convention allowed him to perhaps sense some of the undercurrents of US politics and in US society. But the stuff that he wrote is in publications in the US around the time of the convention.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to acknowledge Savitri Akal, who is in our audience. She is Vijay Maharaj's sister. Welcome, ma'am. And let us now have a question from Marvin Ramanarayan. Marvin, can you unmute? I think you're unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hi, ICC family. Good afternoon, everyone. This is
Hi,
Sharon using Marvin's Zoom. I'm not getting good audio with mine.
Okay.
So my question is to Dr. Vijay Maharaj, who is a Naipaul scholar. And my question is very simple, but I think, you know, it's important. I would like to ask her, if you had to describe Sir Vivian Naipaul in just about 20 words, what adjectives would you use? What would come to mind?
Thank you, Cherry. Dr. Maharaj, can you respond, please? You'll have to unmute, please. Okay, please unmute, Dr. Maharaj.
I'm trying.
We can hear you now.
Okay, can you repeat?
Chair, can you repeat your question, please?
Hi, are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. If you had to describe Sir Vivian Naipaul in about 20 or 30 words, what words would you use? What would come to mind? What can you share with us about your feeling, whether subjective or objective, about him?
I think that objectively speaking, I would say boundary breaking. And I think that that boundary breaking aspect of what Naipaul did influenced us all as post-colonial thinkers and post-colonial writers, and the course of what we are doing now and for the future.
Thank you, Dr. Maharaj. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now welcome Dr. David Dabidine. He is our co-host from the AGI Institute, Amina Ghafoor Institute. Welcome, sir. Please go ahead. Please unmute Dr. Dabidine. Dr. Dabidine, can you try unmuting yourself? Not getting any response. Robin, can you unmute Dr. Dabidine, please?
I'm asking him on mute, but I'll get through.
I wonder. Okay, while we wait for Dr. Dabidine, us hear from Sat. Welcome, Sat. Go ahead, please. You'll also have to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you clearly.
Yeah, this question is to Dr. Tiwari. Doc, I live in the Chaguanas area and I pass by the Lion House on a daily basis and also interact with people who are connected with it, such as a guy who we are trying to get to clean up the front of it. But as you know, people from all over the world come to see this place and we are so thoroughly embarrassed at the state that it is in. I wanted to know what's the exact status of the property at the moment and whether or not there's any move to get the government to recognize it as a heritage site. Thanks.
That has been a problem for a little while, and it really has to do with ownership of the property and the legal hurdles to try and create the conditions for its restoration, its protection, and for its sustainability as a monument and as a site of significance. I don't know the details of it. I have written in one of my columns about this same situation. I mean, hoping for some kind of resolution, but I really don't know what the facts are in terms of the legal hurdles that stand in the way of protection of that property.
Okay, let me just add to that. When we were planning the tour, one of the highlights was indeed the Lion House. And we had spoken with the National Trust to ask them whether or not we can give a tour of the facility and so on. Of course, we are also mindful. We do see the exterior of it and so on. And what we were informed is that it does fall as under a heritage site, but the National Trust is also stymied at this point in time in any action that they can take because of the legal ownership of the property. So I hope that adds a little bit to that. Dr. David Subran, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I am glad this topic came up because I think that the Hanuman House or the Lion House in Chaguanas is really symbolic of Naipaul's reputation. Remember that in his Nobel lecture, he mentioned not only Chaguanas, but described the house. I think it would be an important memorial for this great son of the soil if some non-governmental initiative, talking about business people and so on, if some initiative could be taken to secure this site as a museum. Not long ago, I had to take an editor of a newspaper from Holland to view this house, which he looked upon with reverence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Subran. Dr. Davidine, are you available now? Can you please try to unmute if you're there? Okay, we're not getting a response. Dr. Indira Rampasad, welcome. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Shalima. Good afternoon, colleagues. This question I would like to ask Dr. Tiwari, but anyone can answer from the presenters. You all know that The Mystic Monsieur was actually produced and filmed by Ivory and Merchant, and it was filmed in Trinidad. I had the privilege of being there and being part of the set. Very, very tiny role. I particularly like that novel. To me, it's my favorite. It's my favorite because it dealt with political satire. And I think to some extent it captured the sentiments of some of the politicians of the day. But Dr. Tiwari, I was just wondering, to what extent did you think the film, and I don't know if it was mentioned in this presentation, if I missed it, but I didn't hear anything mentioned of that film, Mystic Monsieur. To what extent do you think it really captured the sentiments of the novel? and of the realities of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I've seen the film, I think, about 3 times. The film is very different from the novel. It's based on the novel, and it loosely draws on the novel. But the film is a different genre, and what a filmmaker would want in a film would be very different, sometimes, not always, from what a novelist or a writer might want. So, I mean, my assessment of each is on its own merit for what it is, the genre that it falls into, and also what its intention, what it tries to do. And I must say, I found, I mean, I don't have to tell you that I love Mystic Monsieur Naipaul's novel, but I mean, I must tell you that every time I watch The Mystic Monsieur, I've watched it, as I said, 3 times, I find that it has its own value and significance. It might not be what Naipaul wrote exactly, but it has its value and significance. I think it's a well-done film.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. Dr. Davidine, are you here with us now? Can you unmute, please? I think Dr. Davidine was having some technical issues and he had to re-enter on Zoom. Ravin, can you try to unmute him?
Well, I was trying, but I saw he was trying to re-enter on a different device, I believe. So if you could try it again.
Okay, Dr. Davidine. Thanks, Ravin. Dr. Davidine, are you with us? Okay, while we wait for his response, let's take a comment from Mr. Chandradat Singh. Welcome, sir. Nice to have you. Please go ahead and unmute. Okay, I think we can hear you now. Yes.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Let me congratulate the ICC once more for the job well done, a great presentation by all the presenters. Very briefly, having traveled extensively in India and visited most of the places that Vijay Naipaul reflected in some of his writings, touched some of the scenes that he touched. I was always amazed by his power of observation, about his power of perception, because as a non-writer, I would look around to see if I felt and saw the same thing that Naipaul saw. Of course, that was impossible. So I'd like to ask Dr. Tiwari to comment on that, to comment on Dr. Naipaul's power of observation and his ability to grasp human existence, human experiences in such brief travels around the world, especially in India.
Dr. Tiwari?
Yeah, I think the others on the panel, certainly Dr. Maharaj, I mean, could comment as well as I would on it. I mean, you have to be a very keen observer and an insightful listener and very intuitive to write anything and write it well. And I think this is true of all writers. And Creighton said something when he was talking about Naipaul, in which he basically talked about the fact that, you know, he had a kind of insight. And I have always found that I find Naipaul very, very remarkable. When you look at the things that he has written, his creation of character, his appreciation of context. I mean, in all his travel writings, Creighton talked about the fact that Naipaul was critical of journalists, and he says that when he does his travel writing, he doesn't do it like a journalist. He does it in a different way. And a lot of what Naipaul does is intuitive. His powers of observation are immense and unique. And I think what is more significant, though, for Naipaul as a writer, and is that a lot of his insights, his intuitive understanding, and his fallback context is from memories and knowledge and notes that he would have had from Trinidad and Tobago, including some insights that he may have gained from his father, Sipasad, because Sipasad was a journalist and he took meticulous notes about everything. I think Naipaul learned that technique and that personal culture from him, VS. And I think it served him well. A lot of the manuscripts that I saw were Naipaul writing notes in handwriting on copybooks and notebooks and so on, whether it was in the case of a bend in the river or in a free state or guerrillas. And I think it's the powers of observation, powers of recall, and as I said, the teaching of his father, the learning that he had from his father, but also his own memory and intuitive understanding of Trinidad and Tobago as a place. But I think there's something else that we must not ignore, which is that he has an amazing and immense imaginative capability. It is not something to trifle over or toy with. I mean, Naipaul really is a genius in that sense.
Thank you, Mr. Creighton. Yes, Mr. Creighton,
yes,
please
yes.
add.
If I may add to that, I think that his recollection is very sharp, and he is extremely imaginative. He thinks of people and characters, and even those with whom he worked when he is researching. He sees them as people. He sees them as belonging to the landscape that he is researching, and he captures all of that. So he's, apart from being insightful, I do think he had a brilliant mind, and I do think that he used his imagination to advantage as a writer there in capturing what he was researching. And all of these made his writing stronger, made his books more interesting and more exciting. And he was quite right when he pointed out two things. When he pointed out the fact that the books don't go stale, and even when he said that he sticks his neck out, he takes risks in the writing, and he doesn't operate like the journalists whom he criticizes. He criticizes the journalists for the way they go about doing their work, and the fact that he goes into the land, he goes on the ground, and he gets his information from people around him and so on. One of the things that strikes me a great deal about Naipaul's writing that I have not seen very much comment on, because I have not seen him being singled out as a genius at the reproduction of Trinidadian speech. And yet I find him better than Selvon. Selvon is often credited with his capturing of speech, of Creole speech and Creole renditions and so on. But if you look at Naipaul's dialogue very dramatically and very vividly captures the Trinidad speech. And I think that all of that comes from what Botiwar is talking about, his mind and the way his mind works. and his very accurate representation of those things.
Thank you so much. Mr. Victor Lal, would you like to add anything? Did you note his powers of observation as a student while you were doing research of his work as a student? You'll have to unmute, please.
Yeah, it's very interesting because unfortunately, because I had some technical problems, but I looked at his term reports in 1950 and 51. The two tutors write about him in his term report, promising, very fluent and quick, a bit cavalier. Results could be very good. In 1951 and 52 term report, they write, a most intelligent and able man. That he's, don't forget, he's only 19 years old at this stage. Very original work, near first for his final exams, much better for industry, lively, original in his essays, promising, industry greatly improved, had a very good term. And in 52 and 53, Peter Bailey, his tutor, and Miss Molly Maureen Mahood, she was at St. Hugh's where Pett was. And later on, she basically is credited with, opening up colonial literature. She was one of Naipaul's tutors, which I did not know until I looked at the report, the 52 report. And the two write, started erratic, misses the point, does quite well. Then they go back and say, very able and intelligent, at his best, deserves a first, cavalier about what he doesn't like. So, so these are from 50 to 53. And what I wanted to point out was that it was in August 1954 that he left Oxford for good to become a writer in London, since we are talking about August. And I just leave it at that point.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ladies and gentlemen, I will open once more for Dr. David Dabadine. Dr. Dabadine, are you hearing us? If yes, can you please unmute? Okay, it's on. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, sir. Go ahead, please.
Sorry, I've been flying away. No, I just wanted to, first of all, thank everybody for participating. And it's so good to see Butiwari after all these years. I just wanted to add very briefly, or to confirm what he said, which was the importance of the British Literature Prize to V.S. Naipaul, the 30,000. Really important for Naipaul. I know this in terms of first-hand experience, because I was one of the judges. There were 7 writers who were judges, and I was one of them, James Heaney and Penelope Lively and other writers. And when his name came up, there was immediate and unanimous agreement that the prize should be given to Naipaul. I know that he was irritated when we had to phone him, when the chair had to phone him to tell him that he had been awarded the prize. He said, "How did you get my telephone number?" He was very irritated. But once he was told that the news was about the prize for 30,000, he really softened. I say this because I do agree very much with Butiwari that Naipaul always had a sense of being short of money, very vulnerable, until, of course, the British Literature Prize helped, and then, of course, the Nobel Prize. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, this has been a very, very interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we've gone over our time by about 20 minutes, so I would like to bring today's presentations to a formal close. However, I will invite you to stay with us so that when the live stream has ended, we could continue the conversation. There are 3 questions in the chat, which are from Dr. Ashford Maharaj, from Robbie, as well as from Errol. Please just stick with us if you don't mind, and we'll ask the presenters to do likewise so that we can get a response. Once again, I want to thank you all presenters for being so excellent in your coverage of Sir Vijay Naipaul. Thank you for taking the time to participate. As I've said before, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center and the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. Feel free to contact us at the ICC to publish your books and reports. Remember, we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions, and if possible, a donation. You can contact Dr. Mahabir for those details. We'd like to say thank you very much to the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Mahabir. Thanks to Ravin Ramsing, our IT manager behind the scene, who has been recording the program. Ravin will edit and upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity. Our topic next Sunday will be Indo Prime Ministers and Presidents in the Indian Diaspora. So please like, share, and follow our Facebook page. I'm Chalama Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless all of you. Dhanyavad.
Thank you very much.